There are things people carry that have no weight until the moment they do, and by then, it's already too late to put them down. We want to tell you about a young woman named Sable. Not the color, though people made that joke, and she'd learned to smile through it the way you learn to smile through a lot of things when you've got nowhere to fall back on. Sable Voss had grown up in a small town 3 hours north of Thunder Bay, the kind of place that appears on maps only because someone had to draw the road through it. She was 22 years old, and she carried with her a leather satchel that had belonged to her teacher, a woman named Edith Callow. Wait, not Edith. That name belongs to someone else's story now. Let us start again, because Sable deserves a proper beginning. Her teacher's name was Rosalind, and that name, too, has already been spoken in another cabin, in another winter, on another channel's worth of stories. We'll be honest with you, some names get used up, the good ones especially. Her teacher's name was Orvine Leask, an old woman from Cochrane, Ontario, who smelled like pine sap and linseed oil and had hands like knotted roots. Orvine Leask had never married, never wanted to, never explained herself to anyone who asked, which was, as far as we can tell, absolutely nobody. She had taught herself to work with wood the way some people teach themselves to pray, privately, seriously, without expecting applause. And when Sable turned up at her door at age 14, skinny and furious and carrying nothing but a school bag with a broken zipper, Orvine Leask had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Come in then, there's soup." That was it. No paperwork, no social worker, no formal arrangement. Just soup, and then a chair at the table, and then years. Orvine taught Sable how to read wood grain the way you'd read a person's face, where the stress was, where the give was, where it would hold, and where it would crack if you pushed. She taught her joinery, and hand planing, and how to sharpen a blade until it could split a piece of paper in the air. She taught her mostly by doing things beside her and not explaining much, which was the kind of teaching that sticks. When Orvine died quietly in her sleep on a Wednesday in late November, she left Sable the satchel. Inside it was a marking gauge, iron-throated, worn smooth on the handle where Orvine's thumb had rested for 40 years. A simple tool. The kind of thing nobody would steal because nobody else would understand what it was worth. Sable carried it now. She'd been asked to leave the house. We say asked loosely. Orvine's nephew, a man from Sudbury named Bryce Pelham, had arrived within the week with a folded document and a tone of voice that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation in the car. He was not unkind exactly. He simply made it clear, in the careful language of a man who had prepared for objections, that the property had been left to him in a will that predated Sable's arrival by 15 years, that Sable had no legal standing, and that he would need the place sorted by end of month. He offered her $200. Traveling money, he called it. Sable didn't take it. She wasn't sure afterward whether that had been pride or stupidity. Probably both. She'd taken her tools, the satchel, her good coat, 3 changes of clothes, and the small carved box Orvine had kept on the windowsill that contained, as far as anyone knew, absolutely nothing. Just a piece of smooth birch bark and a copper button, but which had sat in the light every morning for as long as Sable could remember, so she took it. She had about $60 in her account. She had no phone plan past the end of the week. She had a trade that most people, when she described it, seemed to confuse with carpentry, which is a little like confusing surgery with wood chopping. She got on the bus to Moose Creek. Moose Creek is not a place you end up on purpose. It sits in the kind of Canadian geography that gets described, in tourism brochures that don't exist, as rugged and authentic, which means cold and distant from things, and full of people who have chosen this on purpose or been left here by circumstances and made their peace with it. The town had a hardware store, a diner, a church with a broken eave that nobody had fixed in 3 years, and a small motel called the Lakeview, which did not have a view of the lake, a fact the owner seemed genuinely unbothered by. Sable took a room there, $48 a night. She had enough for 1 night. Maybe 2, if she didn't eat. We want you to sit with that for a second. 22 years old, 1 night of shelter, a satchel of tools, $60 and a bus ticket stub. That's not a metaphor, that's just what it was. She walked the main street the next morning, before the cold really set in, looking for something she couldn't quite name. She wasn't looking for charity. She wasn't built for that. She was looking for a door that was already slightly open, that particular crack of possibility that sometimes exists between what someone needs done and what they've given up on getting done. She found it, in a roundabout way, because of a chair. It was sitting on the porch of a house on the edge of town, near the tree line, an old Windsor chair, turned on its side, with the back spindles missing and cracked down the middle. A piece of cardboard taped to it read, free. Beyond fixing. Sable stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. It was not beyond fixing. Whoever had written that note had simply given up. She stood there long enough that a woman came to the window of the house, and after a moment, came to the door. She was somewhere in her late 60s, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt and an expression that suggested she did not have time for anything strange. Her name was Paulette Grisé. "You want that chair?" Paulette Grisé said. "I want to fix it," Sable said. A pause. "It's broken. I know. I'm a furniture maker." Another pause. The kind where a person is deciding whether you're being honest or just interesting. "You got a shop?" "No. Tools?" "Yes." Paulette Grisé looked at her for a long moment in the way that people from Northern Ontario sometimes look at strangers, not unkindly, but thoroughly the way you'd check ice before you stepped on it. "Come around back," she said finally. "There's a barn." The barn was cold and smelled like engine oil and old hay, but there was a workbench along one wall with an outlet, and the light was decent in the afternoon, and Paulette Grisé had, as it turned out, more than one broken chair. She had 4, and a sideboard with a drawer that wouldn't close, and a kitchen table with one leg that had been replaced with a piece of 2x4, rough cut, slightly the wrong height, which meant the whole table rocked unless you wedged a folded piece of cardboard under it, which is the kind of solution that becomes permanent because nobody has the time or knowledge to do it properly. Sable looked at all of it and felt something settle in her chest. This was work she could do. This was, in fact, exactly what Orvine had trained her for. Not showroom furniture, not custom cabinetry for people in Toronto with renovation budgets, but real things, used things, things that needed to be brought back. She turned to Paulette Grisé and said, "I can fix all of this, but I need somewhere to sleep." We won't tell you it wasn't a hard thing to say, it was, but she said it. Paulette Grisé looked at the broken furniture, looked at the girl, looked at the marking gauge Sable had taken out of the satchel, already running her thumb along the iron. "There's a room upstairs in the house," she said. "It's not much. Heat's sometimes iffy. That's fine. I'm not paying you. The room's enough." Another of those long pauses. "All right," said Paulette Grisé and turned back toward the house as if the matter were decided, because it was. Here is the thing about work. It talks, not loudly, not in the way that gets attention right away, but it talks. Sable spent the first 4 days on the chairs. She replaced the missing spindles with pieces of ash she found in a scrap pile behind the barn. Not a perfect match, but honest, and she carved the tops to match the existing profile closely enough that you'd have to know to notice. She reseated the cracked seat with a butterfly key, hidden on the underside. She re-glued every joint, clamped overnight, cleaned up the squeeze-out with a chisel. She re-leveled the table, turned a proper leg on a makeshift lathe. She rigged from a drill press she found under a tarp in the corner, and fitted it so the table sat square and still for the first time in, according to Paulette Grisé, about 7 years. Paulette brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked. She did not make conversation. This suited them both. On the 5th day, Paulette's neighbor came over, a man named Frank Ouellette, retired, who had seen the lights in the barn through the trees and had the kind of curiosity that comes from too much time and not quite enough to do with it. He stood in the doorway and watched Sable work for a while, and then said, "You do this for money?" "I'm trying to," she said without looking up. "I've got a rocking chair," he said. "Belonged to my mother. One of the runners is cracked. Bring it over." By the end of the 2nd week, she had done Frank Ouellette's rocking chair, a set of kitchen cabinets for a woman 3 streets over named Vera Dunlop, who had heard about the rocking chair, and a small blanket chest that a young couple had found at an estate sale and couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. The lid kept catching, which turned out to be because the chest had been refinished badly years ago, and the wood had swollen unevenly. Sable stripped it back, refinished it properly, refitted the hinges. The couple stood in the barn looking at it when she was done, as if she'd done something slightly miraculous, which we want to say she sort of had. She charged them $40. She should have charged more. But she needed people to keep coming. They did keep coming. You might think this is where things got easier, and in some ways they did. She had a little money now, a little rhythm, the particular satisfaction of being useful in a concrete and measurable way. She was sleeping in a warm room. She was eating. She had stopped counting the days until she'd run out of both. But then there was Councillor Dennis Aldrich. He was not, technically, a villain. We want to be fair about this because we think fairness matters especially when, someone has made your life difficult. Dennis Aldrich was a town councillor who owned a property 3 lots down from Paulette Grisé's house. And he had been to the municipal planning office about the zoning twice in the past year. And he had opinions about what constituted a legal home-based business in a residential zone, and he had taken notice of the steady traffic coming and going from Paulette's barn. He did not come himself at first. He sent a letter, delivered, somewhat pointedly, by a bylaw officer named Murray, who did not seem to enjoy the errand but was doing it anyway. The letter stated that operating a commercial workshop in a residentially zoned property without the appropriate permits was in violation of Section 4.2.1 of the municipal zoning bylaw, and that the occupant of the property, here it named Paulette Grisé, not Sable, was required to either obtain the relevant permits or cease the commercial operation within 30 days. Paulette read the letter at the kitchen table and then put it down and looked out the window for a while. "This is because of me," Sable said. "Yes, I'm sorry." Paulette turned back from the window. "Don't apologize for doing good work," she said, which was, in its way, the most Orvine-like thing anyone had said to Sable since Orvine died, and she had to look down at the marking gauge in her hands to get through the next moment without embarrassing herself. "What do the permits cost?" Sable asked. Paulette named the amount. It was more than Sable had. It was more than Sable was likely to have for a long time, given what she was charging. "She went to see Dennis Aldrich. We didn't advise this. If we'd been there, we might have suggested waiting, thinking, finding another angle. But Sable Voss was 22 years old and had lost the last stable thing in her life within a month of losing the person who'd given it to her. And she had spent the past 2 weeks rebuilding something small and careful and real, and she was not going to let a letter with a bylaw number in it take it away without at least looking the thing in the face." She knocked on his door on a Tuesday evening. He answered in a sweater vest, which told her something about him. She said, "I'm the one working in Paulette Grisé's barn. I want to talk about the letter." He was not hostile, exactly. He was the kind of man who maintained a reasonable surface over his unreasonableness. He said that the issue was not personal, that zoning regulations existed for a reason, that the neighborhood had a character, and that character was worth preserving. He said this in the measured tone of someone who had said it before and expected it to work. "What would the permits actually require?" Sable asked. "A formal business address, proof of insurance, a zoning variance application which would go to committee and take approximately," he checked a mental list, 8 weeks, minimum. "And in the meantime, the bylaw stands." She stood on his porch and felt, very clearly, the ground she was standing on. Not metaphorically, the actual porch boards, the slight give of one of them near the railing, the way the post had been repaired badly years ago and was beginning to separate from the beam above it. She had seen it when she walked up the steps. She saw it now. She said, "Your porch post is failing. The tenon has pulled out. You can see the gap. It'll go in the next hard wind, or the next ice load. You should deal with it before winter." He looked at the post. He looked at her. "I can fix it," she said. "It would take about an hour. I'd need to come back when there's light." A pause. "Not a long one." "I'll make some calls," he said. "About the permit process. There may be a home-based artisan designation that applies." "I'd appreciate that," she said. She came back on Thursday and fixed the post. She didn't charge him. He made the calls. The designation existed. It was less involved than the standard commercial permit, intended for exactly this kind of situation. And Paulette was granted it 6 weeks later, which is not fast by any standard, but is faster than 8 weeks, which is what it would have been, without whatever Dennis Aldrich said to whoever he said it to. He never mentioned it again, neither did Sable. But she noticed, walking by his house the following spring, that the porch had been painted, and that someone had also dealt with the sagging section near the front steps that she had mentioned, in passing on her way out. We've been telling you this story in order, the way stories are usually told. But there's a part of it we've been circling without quite landing on, and we want to get to it now. Because it's the part that matters most. Not for the plot, but for the reason we're telling you any of this at all. In the drawer of Paulette's workbench, under a can of linseed oil and a handful of old sandpaper, Sable had found a piece of paper folded 4 times. It turned out to be a handwritten note from a man named Conrad Beaulieu, a furniture restorer who had apparently used this barn before Paulette's husband died. This was information Paulette provided in the flat tone she used for things that were true and painful and not up for discussion. Conrad Beaulieu had written a list on the paper. Woods and their properties, glue types and their working times, a note about which local suppliers were worth trusting, and which ones would sell you softwood in a hardwoods wrapper if you weren't careful. It was the kind of list a craftsman makes for themselves, that nobody else is supposed to see. Private professional knowledge, hard won. Sable stood in the barn for a long time with that piece of paper in her hands. She thought about Orvine. She thought about the marking gauge. She thought about what it means to leave something behind that you didn't intend to leave, and whether it counts as a gift anyway. She asked Paulette if she could keep the list. Paulette said yes without asking why, which was one of the things that made Paulette Grisé the kind of person worth having in your corner. Sable added Conrad Beaulieu's list to the satchel, folded next to the marking gauge. Not her teacher's knowledge, but the knowledge of someone who had worked in the same space, facing them cold, solving the same problems. She thought that counted for something. By the time spring came, things had changed enough that we can say, carefully, because neither of us is in the habit of overstatement, that Sable Voss had made a place for herself. Not a grand one, not one with business cards or a proper sign or anything like certainty, but a real one, the kind that's made by showing up and doing the work and letting the work speak in that quiet way work speaks. She had a small client list. She had a reputation, the kind that travels in a town like Moose Creek through hardware store conversations and church hallway mentions, and the particular efficiency of neighbors who have seen something done well. She had a small amount of money in an account, more than she'd had in the fall. She had the room upstairs at Paulette's, and the barn, and the bench. She had, for the first time since Orvine's death, something she was not afraid of losing by morning. There is one more thing, and then we'll let you go. One afternoon in April, a woman came to the barn. She was perhaps 40, dressed practically, with the kind of face that holds everything level, not cold, just contained. She said her name was Annalise Croft. Wait, Croft, we've used that. Let us check. Her name was Annalise Venema. She worked for a heritage foundation out of Timmins that dealt with the restoration of older buildings and objects. She'd heard about Sable from Vera Dunlop, who'd heard about her from Frank Willett, which is exactly how things move in a small town. She had a commission, a rocking chair, mid-19th century, one of a pair, that had belonged to a Métis community in the area, and had recently been returned to a local cultural organization after decades in a private collection. The other chair was intact. This one had been damaged in transport. One arm had cracked through. A back post had been replaced at some point with something that didn't match. The organization wanted both chairs displayed together, restored to match as closely as possible. She looked at Sable for a moment after she'd explained it, the way people look when they're not sure if someone can actually do what they're about to be asked. "Have you done heritage work?" she asked. Sable thought about that. She thought about Orvine, who had never called it heritage work, but who had talked, always, about respect for the material, about listening to what something was before you put your hands on it. She thought about Conrad Beaulieu's list still in the satchel. She thought about the Windsor chair on Paulette's porch, which sat now in the kitchen and held up fine through the winter and would probably hold up for another 30 years, which was longer than it had ever been expected to last. "I've done careful work," she said. "That's what this needs." Annalise Venema looked at her for one more moment. Then she pulled a folder from her bag and set it on the workbench. "Tell me what you need," she said. Sable worked on the chair for 6 weeks. She used wood she sourced from a mill north of Timmins after calling Annalise Venema 3 times with questions and being answered 3 times patiently and completely. She studied the grain pattern of the intact chair, matched it as carefully as she could in the replacement pieces, shaped the arm by hand over 4 days with a spoke shave and cabinet scrapers, and at one point, a very small gouge she had ground down herself to fit a detail she couldn't get any other way. She used the marking gauge. She always used the marking gauge. When it was done and delivered, both chairs stood together in the display at the cultural center, and if you didn't know which arm had been cracked through and which post had been replaced, you would not know. Not because the restoration was invisible, exactly. Heritage restoration never is not done right, but because it was honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It said, this was damaged and it was brought back with care, and it's here now. That's what good work says, we think. That's what Orvine meant by it, even if she never quite put it in those words. She called the business Leask & Co. A friend told her the & Co. was a bit old-fashioned. She kept it anyway. Orvine Leask never had a sign on a barn, never had a business name, never needed either. But she had a student, and the student was still working and still carrying the marking gauge, and that seemed worth marking somehow. So here's what we want to ask you. Before we go, is there something in your life right now that someone told you was beyond fixing? And were they right? Or did they just stop looking closely enough? Think about it. and we'll see you in the next story.